Welcome everyone to the Echo Amazonia Lecture series, which is hosted by the Center for Social Studies at the Universidade de Coimbra, a space dedicated to rethinking ecological knowledge, environmental justice, and the plurality of ways of knowing and living on this planet. It is with great joy and deep admiration that we welcome you to today's talk, where opportunity to hear from one of the most influential and original thinkers in Amazonian history and politics. So we are truly honored to have Professor Susanna Hecht with us today, and I would like to begin by warmly thanking her for accepting our invitation. So a brief biography. Susanna is a distinguished professor at the UCLA and director of the Center for Brazilian Studies and professor at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And over the last 4 decades, she has helped transform how we think about the Amazon, not as a passive periphery or untouched wilderness, but as a dynamic, inhabited, and deeply political landscape. She was trained at Berkeley in this rich intellectual environment where geography, anthropology, and soil science were in constant dialogue. Her work crosses boundaries with ease, weaving together ethnography and remote sensing, political economy, and literary imagination. Over the last years, she has published extensively in some of the most respected academic journals across the humanities, social science, environmental studies, and the natural science. What emerged from this body of work is not just the analysis of the Amazon as a biophysical space, but as a historical and political landscape shaped by violence and resistance, desire and extraction. In her work, Amazonian landscapes are not only physical systems, they are inscriptions of power, history, hope, and grief. Her landmark book, The Fate of the Forest, co-authored with Alexander Cockburn, was described as, unquote, a classic in political ecology, urgent, fearless, and still profoundly relevant. More recently, The Scramble for the Amazon and the Lost Paradise of Euclid's da Cunha was awarded the Eleanor Melville Prize for Best Book in Latin American Environmental History. It has been called, in quotes, a masterful blend of environmental history, political analysis, and literary exegesis. So today, Susanna invites us to think with her about utopia and tropicality, about the ideological forces that have shaped nature, science, people, and politics in and throughout the Amazonia. These are not simple abstract questions, right? They touch on some of the deepest struggles of our time between destruction and care, between extractivism and alternative futures and hope, between the forest as resource and the forest as a complex and thinking system. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Susanna Hecht. Susanna Hecht, the floor is yours.
Bom dia, muito obrigada por convite, é um grande honra. Eu vou fazer a minha palestra em inglês, porque elas me deram a opção, mas você vai notar que os slides são um pouco mistura de inglês e português, uns e outros, mas de qualquer maneira, eu vou começar em inglês, mas de vez em quando eu vou fazer alguns comentários em português, que é a língua realmente amazônica. Das línguas, dos 300 línguas amazônicas. Ok, vamos lá. Bom, não toda a coisa que eu gostaria de salientar, what I would like to emphasize, is that not all Anthropocenes are the same. That is, in a big space, a continental space, you can have many things that are different, but not all Anthropocenes are the same. And when you see people talking about the Anthropocene, they often sort of mush it into one thing. So the point is that each Anthropocenes have different political ecologies. colonies. And it's important to keep this in mind as we start to try and think about the utopian and tropicalities, the how to organize society and ways of thinking about land, environments, landscapes, and the world, the Amazonian landscape as an act in itself, not as a passive surface on which history is written, but a place that is a participant and structures the dynamics that we see. So, as you can see here, here are two Anthropocenes, and they're quite different in almost every dimension you would like to ask. So, the point is that the political ecologies and political economies are quite diverse. The one that's generating the most money right now is this acai forest that I have in front of you. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I mean, it's a kind of a complicated talk, but I think that we need to sort of, as they say, walk and chew gum. We need to be thinking about the environment. We need to be thinking in a kind of utopian manner and an experimental manner, in a broader manner, to think about social organizations and the landscapes they produce. That's why I gave you that first slide. We need to really understand, and I'm going to just sort of go through this first, that Amazonia is a pivot in global climate. It's a place where the great acceleration is zooming along. It's got a lot of tipping points. I have some articles on this right now, and it's very volatile. That is, it's from one year to the next. It's reflecting large scale macro dynamics, whether these are economic, geopolitical, scale problems, and environmental problems. So the other thing is that Amazonia has always been a kind of experimental space in different ways of organizing human societies, ecological worlds, and political economies. So it's important to keep in mind that it has a history of experimentation and different kinds of sort of imaginaries about these places. Also that these, as I mentioned, ecological and socio-ecological outcomes of Amazonian utopias and tropicalities give you different landscapes. So you have to sort of be thinking about them in the same time. We also have a natural experiment where we can show what happens when you switch from one form of utopia and tropicality into another. So it's important to realize that there are very good experimental evidence of these. The other thing is that even though I will be speaking mostly about Brazil, it's important to keep in mind that large portions of the South American continent have soberania, has sovereignty over in their countries over areas of Amazonia. It's true that Brazil has most, but in terms of national area, it is not insignificant for many countries. What this means is that when you we talk a lot about Brazil, but when you start to look more broadly, you have this uh, broader question of failed states, flailing states, and actually problems of governance within the Amazonian place because the states themselves are in kinds of crises. And I can think of Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, and as you'll see later, the Guyanas as really in kinds of crises. Well, let me start off with the most important thing, that there's really a lot of tipping points and dominoes that go here. Now, what you can see is that they start with Amazonia, which has a big tipping point, and it's connected to a lot of different things. But what you might notice if you look at where it's connecting is that those areas, things like permafrost areas or the implications of the change in Atlantic currents or the Greenland ice sheets and so on, burning of boreal forests, those are happening in areas of the Atlantic, or Antarctic ice sheets. Those are happening in areas that are largely uninhabited. What is going on is that Amazonia is the key area that is inhabited. So while the other areas that are on this little connection here with its dominoes are mostly managed by large-scale planetary biogeochemical forces, Amazonia's transformation is a function of human action. There are 40 million people who live there. There's about 300 ethnicities. It's a really complicated place. So the point is that if we're going to sort of deal with these questions at larger climate issues, Amazonia is a particularly important pivot because it's there where human action can have the most impact, even though we know that this is not going to be easy, and also that carbon has a very long half-life, and so does methane. This dynamic is producing a lot of methane and other kinds of greenhouse gases. So if we have if we have the dynamics of tipping points, we also have the great acceleration. I apologize for the sort of fuzziness of this chart, but the main thing that you want to keep in mind is the structure of the curves here, which is that they're all going up. They're all going up exponentially. So the problem here is that we may be, as people, more adapted to additive changes, not exponential ones, and we can't quite see them. And that exponential changes give you a lot of volatility, and they change. And the thing about them is they change fast. I don't have to tell you that. So the point is to keep this in mind, and you'll see that a lot of accelerated processes are going on. I'd also like to make a really important point. I'm not going to go through all this slide, but that Amazonia is really different. The adaptation there, which began about, well, 14 to 19,000 years ago, is, oh, excuse me, is an adaptation to an incredibly complex, old, complicated forest. If you look at the temperate zone, those areas have been sort of outside of ice only really about 15,000 years. So it's important to realize that the simplified temperate zone ecosystems that also go dormant for substantial parts of the year are really different in terms of how from Amazonia, which operates very differently. It's a really different ecology, even though we kind of conflate them. So this is why there's like this sort of history of failure, why Amazonia doesn't kind of work as well as you imagine it would. The other thing is that Amazonian ecologies have been thwarting, and Amazonian indigenous populations and traditional populations have been thwarting a lot of emphases in these areas for quite some time, really until 1988. And also, as I mentioned, we have these other questions of Amazonian governance that kind of get lost in the story. But it's a central planetary pivot, and it doesn't really act the way in its comportment, in its way of being, in the way that temperate zones do. So we need to keep that in mind. So we have this complex environment that doesn't really act the same way that temperate zone environments do. And the other thing is that it's not just that it is different, it's that it's the way it was being perceived is very different. I'm often quite irritated when the term Orientalism is applied to Amazonian thinking because it's not. It's not an Orientalist environment. The tropicalities and tropicalisms, the ideologies about the tropics are very different. If you think of Orientalism as a story of sort of degradation, of sort of lost empires, Islamic, that kind of thing, and remember that Europe was very familiar with the African and Asian tropics, but the New World was really different, and so what you have in tropicality is the emergence of really the sort of ends of the earth and the beginnings of time, the ideas of a wild nature and sort of savage brute or noble savages, the idea that it's a kind of ahistorical and acivilizational place, that it's a kind of terra nullius. It's a place of hidden riches, ecological treachery, even though it is a place of marvels and marvelous possessions. It's often seen as being prelapsarian, the lost paradise, but also as a treacherous environment, the counterfeit paradise and green hell. It's important to keep in mind that it always had this idea of sort of taming the wild and that it had a very important role historically in structuring at least the Brazilian state. Also, it's usually taken as a starting point of history, like some kind of, if you look at stage theories, it's kind of like, the barbarous wild world that then goes on through progress into civilization. So the problem is that really it has a different kind of history, and it's seen as having no history or derogatory racial history, and that the taming powers of European states were almost always based more on novel ecologies, so biological imperialism via cattle, sugar, or organized resource use. Tropical landscapes and their meaning in archaeology were very invisible, not only because there were embargoes on the information, but remember that 95% of the population died as a function of the Great Dying in the 16th and 17th century. So in many ways, it was an empty land, and it was a tabula rasa for social experiments. But within this, to just sort of move us rapid, I can walk you through various forms of tropicality, but it would take too long. But we end up sort of now in this kind of situation of four, but I would also add another one here, which is urban political ecologies, but I'm not going to talk about those. But that we talk about an Urnatur, a conservation universe, which is framed in terms of ecology, biotic collapse, extinctions, environmental services, and climate change. So this is the forest primeval imaginary about Amazonia. The other is that it's also a world of extraordinary extension of neo-natures, genomic, monocultural, agro-industrial economy, novel cattle ecosystems, modernist landscapes within a developmentalist, export, and others might say extractive model, ecological and also agronomic. Countering both of these, of course, are the socio-natures that come derived from historical territorial actors. They're agroecological. They depend on both human rights and rights of nature, and non-Western and ontologies and epistemes. So what these socio-natures have done, and you'll see why in a moment, is that they've infused what seemed to be wild nature with an anthropogenic nature, and a nature that is based on traditional knowledge and interaction and respect for nature. This is the rights of nature, the Pachamama, this kind of thing, within also questions of justice and environmental justice, natural justice, as well as sustainability as the discursive framings. Do they always achieve these? The answer, of course, is no. The other thing, excuse me, I have this cold. We have also an emergence, and when I've been thinking of the long time, there's always been clandestine economies in Amazonia, but right now it's sort of gaining ascendance. It's based on deep historic resources, what we might even call the bioeconomy, which is coca, timber, gold, which has been moving out of Amazonia for thousands of years, wildlife gems, and opaque economic circuits. It's always been a major employer. It occurs in a context of laissez-faire, and particularly in the tropicalism of failed states or indifferent states and limited governance, it has moved in as being one of the most economically organizing dynamics. It's one that does not, that is really has a political economy of accumulation and not much interest in the consequences of this, whether they are social or economic. And just to go back for a moment, just to give you a sense, I know that most of you are probably familiar with this, but it has a huge history of Amazonian societies were major engineering societies. We know now as areas get deforested that they bring to light all these large-scale land situations. Let me go a little bit more forward so that you can see these are the raised fields. We now see that there's extensive urbanism with extraordinary connectivity between these. So this is not just an area where sort of things sit isolated in the world, but rather like Europe, that they are constantly in connection both through the rivers and the landscapes and with major roads developed between them. So what you can see here is that there's a lot of connectivity. There are lots of different forms of urbanism. We can think of this as urbanism, but that also structure the landscapes around them, and that there's a lot of this. So this is the other thing that's particularly important to keep in mind, that this isn't even what people are discovering. But you can get a sense from the archaeological sites of the extensive occupation in kinds of urban, proto-urban forms. That is, this was not, maybe there was a lot of migration, maybe there was a lot of periodic circular migration between rural areas and urban areas, but the point is that there were very dense settlements. Right now, the number of sites is being put at close to 27,000 using the technologies of LADAR. I'm going to go back actually to talk about this because one of the things that I think is important that we might think about vis-a-vis the anthropogenic input is that this might be inputs to an autochthonous utopia and an autochthonous tropicality and tropicalism. Its adaptation to a highly diverse world. Simple systems in Amazonia are unstable. It has antiquity. As you know, you who are watching this in Europe are working on landscapes of quite at least 2,000 years in many cases, and longer in others. It is an area of complex civilizations with urban systems and complex engineering, as I mentioned, elaborated land use systems rivaling terraces and irrigation. So I started my work on indigenous knowledge working on Terra Preta. And this is a soil management system that in terms of, as with terraces, as with irrigation, you take an area that seems inappropriate for agriculture and through human manipulation, transform it into among the most highly productive systems on the planet. These are able to support dense populations, complex systems, and are foundational for sustainability and resilience. Once you get that terra preta in place, it doesn't go away. It sits there and is you do some inputs to it, but it also has its own dynamic. Also, the forests are extensively manipulated, so we have to sort of change what we imagine as the forest primeval into something that is more like a garden. The knowledge systems are extensive. This literature really sort of began in the 1980s. It's being rediscovered and re-elaborated. But also the ontology is different. It's not simply that the forest is a resource to be used, but that the forest is a companion in the society. And so these kinds of questions, these tropicalities that derive from other forms of ontology, other epistemologies, are necessary for informing the future. And this is why I talk about this autochthonous tropicality and tropicalism, because the models that we currently have, cattle, soybean, and others, and the mining, simply are not going to survive. Also, this autochthonous tropicalism is not just indigenous, but also include practical utopias like quilombolas, other kinds of hybrid systems, traditional peoples, and so on. So it's important to realize that there has been an evolution from people from outside who've taken on understanding and using the forest within these autochthonous tropicalisms, but also that provides perhaps, and it's in hybrid systems, provides opportunities for us to think about this. I'm going to go through these slides. Okay, so here's an acai forest. As I mentioned, raised fields in Bolivia. This is in southern Pará. This is also in Bolivia, the Baurés. Um, this is in Acre. It's in Brazil. Um, Anyway, the multiple implications of the autochthonous socioecologies. I'm not going to go through this. I've just kind of gone through this for you. But essentially, it has been, if you take this autochthonous socioecology as a starting point, it gives you extraordinary potential for rethinking what Amazonian occupation might look like and how it might unfold. So our big problems, of course, are the historical erasure of pre-Columbian dynamics and even modern areas. The rubber boom is kind of a cipher. It was kind of an embarrassment in some ways, but actually it has many important lessons from it. The questions of the great dying, I think I mentioned it already, but Amazonia was also really hit very hard by COVID. We have still the problems of state legibility and the preference for modernist landscapes, simplified, gridded out landscapes. The models of occupation and their imaginaries are, as I say, modernist, simplified, controllable, using packages, what Bruno Latour would call immobile mobilities. That is, that the package moves around versus immobile systems that are created in place, but are informed by place. The other thing is also there's invisibilities of multiple types. A lot of the producers in Amazonia are invisible, most of the acai producers, for example. There's lots of highly productive dynamics that are going on that fall outside of the frame through which this gets us to the state legibility problem, that they simply can't see them. They can't see the kinds of transformations that are going on or the kinds of economies and ecologies. The other thing is that Amazonia is kind of an interior colony of most of the Amazon, the 9 Amazonian countries. And so in a certain sense, even though in 1822, it was, before it was handed over to Pedro, it was itself an autochthonous colony. But at that time, it was thought you couldn't really be a country without a colony. And so Amazonia was sort of put under the hegemony of the emergent Brazilian Empire. They have had a lot of, how should we call it, revolutions. The cabanagem and all these other things were part of these stories, but is a story also of internal colonialism, which has a lot of implications. We could theorize perhaps about what might have happened had Amazonia had its own destiny to describe rather than simply the one of external actors. Okay. History bounces around, as we know, and one of the most important things to think about is that authoritarian regimes like simplicity and don't like complexity and don't like much participation. 1988, of course, was the year, a key year in Brazilian history and politics. But what I really want to point to is that this was the year that the Brazilian Constitution, the novel modern Brazilian Constitution, was elaborated. It was an ascendance of politics into some globalized frameworks of human rights and so on, but also traditional historical rights. That is, it recognized long-term occupations, long-term manipulations, and also could invoke archives and other historical sources. So what it did is it gave legitimacy to the territorial claims of indigenous and traditional peoples. And this, of course, becomes very important. The other thing is the idea, the concept of environmental crimes and early intimations of the rights of nature elaborated in the Pachamama of Ecuador and Bolivia in their constitutions. Also, it changed the world in a lot of ways that environmental politics was seen as a regional, national, and global enterprise. In this, it really diverged from sort of the simple pollution politics of the US. It also worked with financial levers, the political side, supply chain. We can see this working now with boycotts and zero deforestation things. And it signaled the end of one phase of the authoritarian regimes and an opening of markets and this is so we're also sort of at the end of the neoliberal moment as well. We're hitting like another one of those big historical pivots like 1988. But one of the things that's really important about this is that it had a conceptualization of multiple modernities. And I'm not going to go through this. This is already sort of mentioned, but it dovetails sustainability, social sustainability and ethnography into development thinking. And the participation included people from quilombolas. These are indigenous people. These are the Kayapo. I contrast this with the Slavocrats who designed the American Constitution, but it had a much different dynamic in terms of its construction. And in this sense, it's a quite radical document, the Constituinte do Brasil. Again, here we go. One of the things that this is important to look at is that while there had been this idea that, of course, it was empty Amazonia, historically, you even had things like Euclides da Cunha's map of the Rio Purus in 1906 that shows the extensive occupation of the Rio Purus, which is reimagined as a wild and empty space. So the point here is that what had been imagined as a critical economic space and mapped as such becomes reimagined as an empty space later on. This conflict between the imaginary of the empty and the reality of the inhabited, of course, comes into play quite widely. Another sort of lost history is that of the quilombolas. Of course, that was known from the question of when quilombolas, for those of you who don't know, are, I'm sure most of you are watching this do know, are runaway slave areas. They're now called areas of afrodescendentes. And these were basically slave refuges. Most of these they've been in place for 450 years. A lot of the ones in the Brazilian Amazon, and this is hardly complete, came about during the Cabanagem in 1835, when at a moment of sort of revolutionary turnover, numerous Black communities were reestablished. These were areas which João Reis calls the invention of freedom. What they did, of course, what this dynamic did, is it redrew the map of the Amazon as a place of social environments. That is, it wasn't just a place of simple conservation for whatever reason, valuable reasons, but also that inhabited environments could be areas in which forests and livelihoods could coexist. This is actually kind of a novel idea within the New World, which basically had divided the world into the Urwald, the agro-industrial world and urban areas, as opposed to an area like this, which had complex livelihoods and conditions of possibility within a forest-based economy. But there are other maps. This is the fire map. And what you can see, of course, here is that in areas where you don't have indigenous or conservation units, you have a lot more fire. This is, of course, spewing greenhouse gases and definitively transforming landscapes that could produce livelihoods and an array, a complex ecology into simplified landscapes for just one or two species. So the whole dynamic of forest protection is linked to not just simple conservation areas, but inhabited environments with the guardians of the forest present. What this means also is this is a dynamic of extraordinary controversy and violence and pressure. Another map here is the simple map of major roads. This doesn't do justice to the array of roads that are being built because there's huge amounts of informal roads, but 95% of the deforestation occurs within 5 kilometers of roads. So they are sort of, if you will, the thin edge of the wedge on deforestation. But also what you can see in this map is the dynamics of large-scale integration, large-scale mapping of dams, that these are actually ruin environmental connectivity and so on in the area. And also that gold has become a major element here. I put this up simply to say, well, when we look at deforestation, this is what we tend to see, but I always like to contrast it with this picture, which was done by an indigenous person, a Paraguayan, who, when they see this deforestation, see also all the animals and all the livelihoods and all the other things that go along with that simple conversion. Hold on, let me go back. Boom. Oop, nope, nope, nope. Go forward, sorry. That responds to our understanding of simplification, but when what you see in this, of course, is not just simplification, but extinction of an array of organisms, from birds and insects to mammals and so on, and the loss of integrity and the loss of place. So that in essence, it makes it impossible for these organisms to persist in a context of this kind of deforestation. Well, what we do know from our experience is from 2004 to 2012, using environmental institutions, aligned governance, formal and informal agreements, monitoring land change, enforcing environmental laws, green commodity chains and markets, participatory regional actors, science-based policy, social institutions to support livelihoods, research credit and so on, and social movements for equity, you can really get a significant decline in deforestation. This produced an 80% decline in deforestation. So it's not that, and you can see that it's a volatile story. It goes up and down and up and down. So what we can see is that governance really matters a lot. Oh, excuse me. Hold on, I'm going to just take a little slurp here. But when we go further on, we can take a natural experiment and see what happens if we pull that governance away. So what did we have? No more demarcation of indigenous or traditional lands. Indigenous lands shifted from management, autochthonous management, to management by the Ministry of Agricultura, Ministerio de Agricultura, an assimilationist indigenous policy, degazetting conservation areas, amnesty for cleared areas, the use of remote sensing cadastral tools from regulatory to speculative instruments, cutting environmental budgets, um, the firing, surveillance and monitoring directors and gutting those institutions, defunding research. God, this sounds like I'm describing the United States. Drastic university cuts. So we move from states of knowledge into sort of rule by social media, the emergence of the 1988 Lei do Temporal, which is it's very complicated. Basically, it says if you were not occupying that land in 1988 and it was recognized then, your claims on other lands are not valid. And then an increase in rural violence, drastic defunding of research budget, and also COVID undermined these relations even more, as they say, passar a boiada em cima da gente, because it was impossible to do anything. So what this shows you is what happens when you take all of those regulatory things off. And I think deforestation is a fairly good indicator of environmental and governance, forms of governance dynamics. So what you can see here is um, by 2012, we have this low amount. We have this instability going on during the exile, the impeachment of Gilma, and then you come in here in 2018, and you get this extraordinary increase in deforestation as a function of the Bolsonaro Amazonian politics. Well, what happens is you can sort of see here, but while you can control deforestation and you can see that these burn scars and stuff go up, but one of the things that's important to realize in this last area is that even though you may be able to control deforestation a bit more, which certainly happened in the new Lula environment, already the ecological dynamics are such that you had incredible forest fires and fires in Amazonia as a function, not just of management, although there was that, but also that climate change had started to really kick in. So this is this El Nino dynamic, which basically sent Amazonia into flames. And the areas that don't burn are, you'll be amazed to hear, indigenous areas. The other problem that happens, of course, come on, is drying of terrestrial rivers, both as a function of deforestation and as a function of climate change. This was particularly that El Nino year. This is the Rio Madeira, so this also undercut the hydropower dynamics of the region almost everywhere as a function of the loss, a drastic decline in rains. In the Pantanal, the world's largest wetland, had a drought that diminished it by a third. You would not want to be one of these capivaras. You can see the sort of smiling caiman there, but you wouldn't want to be one of these capivaras as these animals concentrate in the few areas where there's still water. And it's not just the terrestrial rivers that dry up, but it's also the atmospheric rivers, what we call aerial rivers, which is that the forest itself generates huge amounts of water, that these become critical for running the aquatic system. So this is also why the tipping point here is so important. So we have the moisture coming in from the Atlantic, it's recycled, it hits the Andes. But this really strongly affects the water systems of the Andes and glaciation. But then the water goes down and produces rainfall in southeastern South America. If you start to reduce that, of course, what you get are the massive effects of the lack of water for Sao Paulo, which became critical, and the tipping point of savanization of large areas of Amazonia into various forms of things. So we're looking at not just sort of dramatic climate change as a function of this, but also that those dynamics are not located just in Amazonia, that they go far and wide. Now, so the impacts of these changes in Amazonia have lots of impacts, but the current geopolitics also have a lot of impacts on Amazonia. I've given you a picture here of the war in Ukraine. But this has, of course, enormous impacts on global demand for grains, soy and corn, for particularly. Those are areas in which Amazonia has very great capacities, as well as other countries such as Bolivia, such as Argentina in the Chaco, in transforming and expanding the agro-industrial, the neo-nature frontier. Oil disruptions and energy politics look like they are going to continue. The COPs having been the climate meetings having been held in petrostates, there is now sort of a change in ideology about the importance of oil, and Amazonian deposits, as you'll see in a minute, are really important in terms of the new global OPEC and the role of Amazonia and all the things that go with Amazonian oil extraction as a larger set of problems. Gold demand. Gold just hit $3,500 an ounce as both an investment for financial areas and also as a hedge against other things as the dollar loses its value. Tariff politics, I'm not going to go into. We have serious governance problems, of course, going on. We have a new hegemon for Latin America, which is China, and its need and demand for global commodities, as well as the internationalization of cartel politics, with Mexico and Armenia playing significant roles in the regional economies. Well, so we have this bovine colonialism here, which undermines almost everything. What you can see is the exports of beef in Brazil. Again, this is a kind of a great acceleration thing, but what's important to realize is that the expansion of livestock will go hand in hand with these other dynamics. Another great acceleration curve, the role of Asiatic imports in the soy economy, and that will only get more extreme as China refuses to buy American commodities, and the European supply chains of these commodities of soy and corn are disrupted. So keep an eye on that. Real gold prices. This is based on 2010 dollars, but what you can see is, again, one of those great acceleration curves. So the changes are going on extremely rapidly, and it's very difficult to be responsive to these. As I mentioned, the spot price is $3,500. This is in terms of real 2010 dollars. So it doesn't look quite as dramatic, but you can certainly see how it operates. And this is what it kind of looks like. This, particularly for gold, it's running deforestation now in all 9 countries. Its cumulative deforestation has been over 2 million hectares. It's grown by 50% in the last 6 years, and a third of this mining is in protected and indigenous land. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like on the landscape when you just pull it out. But what you can see is sort of an expansion of new mining areas. The Guyanas remain very important. Peru, of course, is expanding in Bolivia, and Ecuador and Colombia are starting to go. Venezuela has always maintained an active gold economy, particularly in areas that are protected. And this is the sort of list of criminal groups in the Amazon and where they are. And you can sort of do a bit of an overlap with the gold economy. And particularly if I had a map of coca production, you could see that as well. And I did have a map of timber extraction, but I didn't put that on because of reasons of time, and we need to get moving along. So the other thing, as you can see, there's a kind of instability in the global petro market. And while there are certainly the Middle East remains complicated, the U.S. is generating a lot of more is in its drill, baby drill, because for whatever reason, we have plenty of energy. But what you can see now is that on June 17th, there's going to be a major auction of production blocks in Brazil and elsewhere in Amazonia. So these are the main oil production areas that are or air the potential blocks. And you can see that this is going to be has the potential to be quite dramatic. The problem with petrostates is that they are not great. I mean, you could be Norway, but your probability is to end up more like Venezuela. And we already see this, of course, in the extraction along the Guyana coast and at the mouth of the Amazon. I'm not sure I have an Amazonian. Um, I don't have a I don't have a slide for that. But this gives you an idea, and you can certainly get a sense of who's winners and losers in this. And again, this is the sort of development of petrostates. The largest GDP per person is in Guyana, but it's what do you call it? Human development indices are still remain among the lowest in the problem in the world. So, what about utopias and tropicalities? One, they've changed over time. We know that this is an area of social experimentation and military developmentalism, tycoon capitalism, and so on. But also, those informal utopias have had durable histories and are interactive with formal systems and global economies. So, their domesticates have actually been the profound organizers of global tropical economies for a long time, not just in Brazil, and that there's always a sort of a new pipeline on global economies and bioeconomies. The point here is this is why I wanted to talk about autochthonous tropicalities, because it's informed by a kind of different idea of what Amazonian nature is. It's important to realize that Amazonia is regularly hit by massive changes, the great dying, the commodity booms, the failure of rubber, the gold dynamics now, the toxification of its rivers and areas by mercury, so that the dynamics of environmental change are not just locally in terms of, let's say, something like soil nutrient decline in pasture, but have global ramifications. It also has a history of large-scale biophysical events, and the point that I would especially want to make is that we're in a dynamics of sort of the tropicalities of accumulation versus tropicalities of existential survival. In the dynamics right now of accelerations and tipping points, there are 40 million people who live there, but this is also a dynamic in which there really are libraries of knowledge, which is extremely important. And the other thing I want to make, the point that I want to make here is that indigenous is not niche. I think we have the idea, oh, those, as it was described to me as I was beginning to work around the Kayapos. Well, they run around naked and paint themselves red. That doesn't mean they don't have a science. Much of European scientific understanding was elaborated by working with New World indigenous knowledge systems and germplasm. These were globally transformative, and it's potentially a new time for this as well. It certainly made tropical colonialism more possible through quinine, but also expanded manioc and sweet potato production that kind of shifted Africa and China out of a Malthusian trap. Foundational contributions have been systematically underemphasized and underappreciated simply because these populations are seen as living out of time, when in fact they've been engaged in time all along. And also, many Amazonian countries have majority indigenous populations. So in essence, what we need to do is not think of this as so much an area in which is empty and which there is being colonized by white populations, but perhaps animate more its indigenous history. And also what we're seeing, this latter thing, indigenous blood, is a picture that I took in Geneva, which is that indigenous movements are getting much better at managing international as well as national politics. And we can certainly see this in the indigenous movements that are now hurling through all of the Amazonian countries. And finally, and this is from, from the New York Times, you'll note here, ecological crime scene. The Amazon has seen our future. This was like a separate thing. And it has kind of seen our future. And of course, I always never lose an opportunity to quote Euclides da Cunha, who described Amazonia as the last unfinished page of Genesis, marvelously writing itself, although this time it will be written in human hands, not in the hands of God. But there não há exemplo mais típico de progresso às recuadas. Vamos para o futuro sacrificando o futuro, como se andássemos no véspero do dilúvio. And as he also points out, tal é o rio, tal é sua história, revolta, desordenada e incompleta. And of course, we have a common future. So say hi to the Pyrocene and Los Angeles in flames. And many of you might have seen this sign. The Getty Center Drive, Sunset Boulevard, Wilshire Boulevard, my university's over here. All of this is burning. Vocês para ter o interesse no assunto, para participar e também por convite. Rafael e eu tenho muito tempo para organizar isso, porque não, I can't go, I have to be there. Mas agora deu certo.
Nós é que
Perfeito.
agradecemos muito a sua presença aqui, o Rafael, agradeço ao Rafael também o ter organizado aqui e propiciado este encontro e agradeço a presença de todas e todos. Susana, espero que possamos continuar esta conversa no futuro, nos próximos meses, nos próximos anos. Peço às outras pessoas que estão aqui presentes para continuarem a seguir então o ciclo de palestras ECO. Nós vamos sempre anunciando na nossa página e também na mailing list. Portanto, muito obrigada pela presença de todas e todos.
Ok, muito obrigada.
Tchau, Susana.
Obrigado, gente.
Tchau.